Hey guys. So a lot of people wonder why we should discuss politics in the first place. And the reason is because it allows you to try to gain a better understanding of context and human history and human behavior in context. And of course we have, luckily, we have quite a bit of information to draw upon. But the reason that we discuss politics, or the reason that I do, is to try to come up with a framework that will prevent mistakes from being made again. And humanity has, unfortunately, a habit of forgetting the past. And partly that's because so much of what we have now allows us to rewrite the past in our own favor. And I think we've sort of forgotten that any sort of infringement or impingement upon integrity ends up creating further problems down the road. And the reason for that is because we suddenly have to recreate a record using whatever information we have, and also, while also determining the falsities or the propaganda within that information. So every generation has to deal with propaganda as it pushes the limits. And most historians will say, well, this is a natural progression of human progress. In other words, the older generation wants to maintain the status quo, and the younger generation pushes back against it. Over time, the cultural values change. And that's not a given. It's not a given that, say, mayors in southern Mississippi will be burning Beatles records online in the 1960s, and then suddenly you sort of pave the way for greater music to come out of that area. Whether it's bluegrass or whether it's one of my favorites, it's called outlaw country. Anyway, but that's not a natural progression. All of that assumes that violence will be kept to a minimum against the opposition. And for that to exist, you have to have a framework in place that essentially acts as a mediator, but also as a speed bump against excess and extremism. So it's not a given that progress is always going to happen, because this generational conflict has to be kept, in most cases, nonviolent in order to continue. And the reason for that is violence. This is what Martin Luther King was trying to teach us. He was telling us that violence always tends to beget violence. And the reason for that is that in history, if you look at it, whether you're bombing North Vietnam, or whether you're attempting to enforce security through violence or lynchings, for example, and once again in Mississippi or Alabama, once again all of that tends to multiply in other ways. And this goes back to an economic law that I tend to really focus on, which is that it's an offshoot, a corollary of first do no harm. And the reason for that is whenever you do something, you displace multiple entities around you. The most obvious example of this would be an economic example. So if you give, say, religious organizations a tax exemption, what you're doing is you're driving money. Your intent would be to promote religious freedom, but what you're actually doing in addition to that is you're creating an advantage artificially for a certain group of people or groups of people. And so in that case, suddenly the money which might have otherwise gone into the private sector to open up a McDonald's, which might be more accessible to everyone else in that community, would favor opening up a coffee shop or a food establishment suddenly that's in conjunction with this nonprofit entity. We can call it a church, but it doesn't have to be a church. But hopefully you understand my point. The minute you give an advantage artificially to X, what you're doing is you're driving the capital towards that area, thereby disadvantaging all other competitors. And when that tax advantage or when that artificial advantage is focused on a pre-existing group, and in almost every case it is, the majority it almost never provides a benefit to the minority without having that benefit flow through them. So even if you pass a law, typically the laws have to be enforced, and they get enforced by people who are connected with the establishment, whether that's judges who are elected by the political establishment or just, lawyers. And today it costs a substantial amount of money to become a lawyer. And so while you might have outliers, the fact of the matter is if you want to get something done through legislation, even or even on the local level through litigation. In many cases, you're dealing with an existing patchwork or an existing status quo of lawyers that might have known each other for a couple of generations, making it difficult for new entrants to come in and try to claim equality before the law. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're all subject to bias, and again, the point of studying politics and history is to try to understand that bias so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, but also so that we continue to progress and create a world where we understand that the framework matters. And one of the issues with politics today is the failure of diplomacy. And I say this, in Singapore, where we are about to have a U.S.-North Korean summit. And it's very significant because technically the war between North and South Korea has never ended. There was never a treaty. And so, on paper, you have this idea that you have two nations that are still at war. One of which, actually, quite frankly, both of which might have access to nuclear weapons. Or at least, at the very minimum, chemical weapons, or other ways of disrupting each other's economies, which are now, because of globalization, linked to many other economies and many other trade agreements. And so it's not just a butterfly flapping its wings in one area, which would create an impact, and then in another area. The globalization's benefit and downside is that you have everyone's linked together, and therefore we have an interest in each other. That should cause us to be more tolerant of each other and more curious about each other. But in reality, this framework that was supposed to be utilized through the UN has been fragmented. And so we've actually taken this, we've taken trade agreements, we've taken all these other, gap-based or TPP types of agreements, and we've actually made them, more difficult for the poor to succeed. And part of that is just because you have, not only technology, but you have so many, vast differences in currency valuations and economies. Many countries are still operating under the presumption that agriculture is the primary economic output. And that's, of course, not true everywhere. And the modern countries have shifted into services and in many cases may not need or may insulate themselves from agricultural tariffs or other means of advantaging certain industries over others within trade agreements through technology, which is, greenhouses. I just had one of the best apples in my life here in Singapore, and I wasn't aware that you could grow apples in such a humid climate until I realized this has to be from a greenhouse or some sort of insulated area, and that goes back to a lot of other issues. So, getting back to my point, why is politics so important? So let's take another example of a conflict that is ongoing. And that would be the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And this has gotten a lot of play in the West. And I think one of the reasons is because it gives you an idea about whether or not you favor might makes right. And that's the direction that we're going into because the UN has failed to enforce any sort of peace. And when that happens, it's just like deterrence in the military sector. When you create violence, in many cases, it only works historically between big countries that have very little chance of taking each other over. Now, the U.S. will never occupy Russia; it's too big. Russia will never occupy America; it's too big. It's just not worth it to expend that kind of resources. And so, the military might has typically acted as a deterrence. Under a deterrence framework where you build up, you show the other side that, doing something that would violate a moral precept or a legal precept, such as invading another country, would have costly consequences. And accept that all this money that's being used in military expansion is actually, now has shifted into what's called economic statecraft, where suddenly Russia invades Crimea, and it does so on the basis of what it feels is a legitimate desire to protect Russian-speaking and ethnic Russians within a increasingly hostile climate. And Russia's idea is, number one, you owe us natural gas bills that you haven't paid, and number two, more importantly, the argument is that the U.S. has flooded this market with anti-Russian propaganda, thereby or anti-Russian news. And thereby trying to influence local elections in ways that harm the Russian population in Ukraine and other ex-Soviet territories. And, it's almost, one of the other problems, and of course, the Americans would rightfully argue that actually you can't just walk into a place and take it over. When Saddam Hussein did that, in Kuwait, we pushed him back. And the reason for that is literally the founding basis of the League of Nations, where you cannot invade, stronger nations cannot invade the territorial sovereignty of smaller nations. And what's happened in Crimea, the U.S. would argue is a violation of that, except that you no longer have military action, because again, military action really only works to reduce violence, from big countries to big countries, except that this is no longer being used. It's only being used by small countries and small areas, and for big countries, they're actually using economic sanctions and so on. That's unfortunately, it's not really as viable because. It's a situation where it's just not working. And we know that because, not just because of increased cyber attacks, but because primarily, this is my argument, we don't have a framework in place. So if there's a cyber attack against Estonia, there's no framework in place for when you can commit boots to the ground, when you actually invade and try to give somebody their country back or their land back. Or what is the framework that you use when you have an allegation that X country is not protecting its Russian minorities or its Russian-speaking population properly, thereby, necessitating unilateral force. And if you believe Russia, then you believe that its force, in this case, was justified. If you don't believe Russia, then you believe that the force was not justified. However, my argument is that we're forgetting that there's a framework in place that should have resolved this issue without force, and that's diplomacy, that's the United Nations. The whole idea of the UN was that you would have a cooling off period where you would have an independent arbitrator evaluate the claims and then come up with a resolution that would be respected by all countries, big and small. If the UN or a similar organization has failed to retain its credibility, all of this goes away, and suddenly force and violence become more accepted in society, which then leads to increased military spending, which really shouldn't be happening if, in fact, the world is becoming a safer place. Most countries, especially smaller countries, should not be thinking about increasing their military budget in order to fall under the NATO security umbrella. What they should be doing is really trying to figure out how to reduce inflation in housing and education especially. Except, again, if you don't have a framework in place, none of this matters. Violence becomes the default method in the absence of diplomacy. And the reason we discuss politics is because we want to understand whether the person we're talking to understands that historically we have tried to progress beyond, an eye for an eye. And the way that we've done that is we've created all these international bodies, such as the UN, that are supposed to mediate disputes, including economic disputes, through the WTO. And if that's not happening, it's clearly not happening because violence worldwide, weapons sales keep going up. Fragmented militia groups, seem to be increasing worldwide, including in the U.S. through, in the U.S.'s case, through white supremacist groups. And so you have all these different things happening, and you get the sense that despite these statistics, often cited by Steven Pinker, the world is actually not becoming a better place. And I think we fundamentally understand that because we are witnessing a return to the era of might makes right because of the failure of diplomacy and the lack of credibility of the UN, which is now attempting to create more social progress, which is fine, but without its original purpose, which was to essentially prevent war and excessive military buildup. The idea really was, especially with Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, and the idea really was eventually we would have not just nuclear deproliferation, but also just all weapons would eventually go by the wayside. Merely, and that's actually what's happened now is the exact opposite. There's been a nuclear club. The nuclear club is now, trading with each other economically because a lot of the trade is tied into security agreements and NATO membership. And so the reason we discuss politics is because we want to understand whether you actually believe that violence solves anything. And with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you will often hear, and I had a law professor at Santa Clara Law School in California tell me, well, if you had people shooting rockets into your country, what would you do? And number one, the actual reality is that the advanced anti-missile protection system means that the rockets that are fired by the Hamas, a group within the Palestinian territories, don't actually make it into the Israeli land, or don't really, they sort of seem to hit a shield and fall by the wayside. Although it is true that I think a soldier on a military base was actually killed a few years ago as a result of the rocket. And the argument is, what would you do? Would you simply stand there and continue to, take a hit simply because you are the bigger, more advanced nation? And the idea behind this is that you don't end up with, say, somebody spontaneously shooting rockets at you. You don't end up with people spontaneously or for no reason building tunnels where they live in order to transport material, for food and other resources, including rockets. And you don't end up with any of this spontaneously. You don't end up with people trying to use human shields, allegedly, or stash some weaponry and weapons in other civilian areas without some cause. Human beings are surprisingly rational when presented with accurate information. And so when you talk to people about this issue, you have to get them to understand that why is this happening? People are not, this isn't, number one, this isn't the case anywhere else, right? This isn't happening anywhere else. What is happening here? And what you'll often find is that people that are biased or that don't understand history and context will start talking about a lot of other extraneous issues, primarily, unfortunately, what I would call propaganda. And so the reality is that human nature just hasn't changed that much. When you kill somebody on the street, you're not going to increase peace. As Martin Luther King said, violence begets violence. And so this has happened throughout history. When the Americans bombed North Vietnam in an effort to win the war, the opposite happened. The North Vietnamese actually joined the Chinese-backed communist forces, thereby defeating the United States. It hardened their resolve. And in fact, you can look at military and violence trying to drive out other violence. It only works in genocide. So in other words, if you want to use violence, if you're the Americans, what you have is a situation where you attack the Native Americans, and of course everyone claims self-defense when they do any of these things. That's another important aspect to understand about history. Nobody attacks anybody else. It's always self-defense. It's always protection of a higher ideal, whether it's protection of a Russian-speaking minority or whether it's protection of your own home, etc. And the reason this has happened in history is again, a lack of diplomacy, a lack of a neutral arbitrator to resolve these claims in a credible way. But again, unless you have genocide, typically, which is what happened with the Native Americans, in almost every case, violence fails. You can argue with, say, in fact, Bosnia and Sarajevo and all these other, the Balkan territories. You can say that at least, wait a second, look at this, look at Bosnia, that actually worked. The military came in, but the military came in, through the United Nations a cooperative effort. It wasn't just, everyone was helping the Bosnians, including the Iranians, the Americans, and you had a situation where this was an international effort, which is exactly why it worked. You can look at slavery in the U.S., which was enforced by massive violence, whether it was lynching, and you can look at that and say, well, from the point of view of the white landowners and the slave owners, it worked. They continued to have property. If you go into the South, you see vast estates which have been converted from plantations. You see all of this, and this is all. This was quote unquote on the behalf of the people committing the violence. This is a good thing. Even though they lost the Civil War, the South did, we still have a vibrant community that is very different from everyone else. In other words, we managed to retain our culture. The fact of the matter is, the southern states, if you look at the entire country, war, again, displaces everything else around it. It's, again, the same thing as giving X an advantage. What we talked about earlier is if you give one person a tax break, it alters the entire flow of capital. In the same way, war alters almost everything, not just the flow of capital, which is being destroyed, and then has consequences for insurance, for rebuilding, for UN participation, for refugees. It has and if you can only imagine the consequences that a tax break could have in the United States, you can now imagine what consequences war has. And And in America, you can look at the long-term consequences, even 100, let's see, 1865, even 150 years, the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War. You have a situation where you still today have social problems in America between that flow from the Civil War and the reasons the Civil War was enacted or was fought. And so, and ultimately, you can argue even today that America is more segregated than it was before as a country and as a people, especially when you include informational segregation and the kind of information that different areas receive through either social media or other areas. None of which would be possible if you had community-based organizations that are able to bring people together in a form of diplomacy. Somebody alleging international interference wouldn't work if you have a community where you can actually meet and say, listen, this is what I saw, is it true? And then you can have a leader in that community that has access to accurate information, correcting people. None of these, again, all of these allegations of violence, all of them depend on a failure of diplomacy and a failure to prioritize community relations. And so suddenly violence from the police becomes acceptable simply because, you have a situation where, there is no other way. Anything, and in fact, the attempt to create alternatives oftentimes is only a show. And in many cases, you'll have a so quote unquote privacy commission or a police, a police ombudsman of some sort. Ultimately, it's called internal affairs, so it can do an internal audit, and it's supposed to be independent, except that in almost every case, in America at least, they can only give recommendations or suggestions. So you can have your voice heard, but nothing actually has to be done. And so you're seeing, that is again a form of propaganda. You have to have actual diplomacy that gets things done. And when that fails, you see the same thing happening, right? Violence continues. Minorities continue to be oppressed. And might continues to enforce its singular philosophy, which is to become right and to displace everyone else around it. And so none of these things will change until we understand what diplomacy stands for, and also that the only way to incorporate or to stamp out violence is historically, if you look at Sinn Féin and the IRA. It's been to incorporate those extremist elements, to recognize that they have a legitimate grievance, and to incorporate them into the existing political framework. That worked. That's an example of what worked there. We have many examples of this, but the other example would be simply legalization. We had prohibition, the mafia, Al Capone and so on. That's where they made their money. And so with prohibition, it actually increased crime. It increased the power of the mafia, which again had long-term consequences. Because they then took that money and then moved into other areas of protection and of illicit trade. And so we recognized that with alcohol, and then we legalized alcohol in America with many restrictions and many regulations. And as a result, the mafia no longer makes money. The black market